Adams Archive.
The U.S. Army asked the troops who they fired, who they gave dishonorable discharges to, just come back, right? The people that they got out of the military, right? The U.S. Army kicked people out of the military for not having the vaccine, for not getting the vaccine, for not agreeing with an experimental drug being injected into their bodies. Now they're telling them to come back. Come back. We won't even mandate that to you. And I think there's a bigger play at hand here. I don't think it's just as simple as them saying, hey, we're missing recruiting numbers. I think it's bigger than that. I actually think the reason that they're doing this is to mitigate legal costs more than very likely anything. So let's look at this together. This comes from the post-millennial, and it says the U.S. Army asked troops who left over COVID mandate to come back as war looms. Now, I don't know if that's the reason why. I think this might be more of a legal play than anything, but the United States Army is inviting, because if you're in the Army, you're not going to be able to sue the Army, right? But there could be a large class action lawsuit against the institutions that mandated this, especially when it was the federal government. The United States Army is inviting service members to return to the branch who had been separated over the refusal of the COVID-19 vaccine. This comes as the U.S. military struggles to achieve targeted recruitment numbers due to years of woke political activism, which has reportedly turned off its primary recruitment base. And you see this. You see I think it was the Air Force now doing special forces videos for recruitment where it's all white men. How dare you? How egregious. Could you imagine a military that was mostly occupied by straight white men who don't dress up as, women on their weekends to shake their ass for dollar bills at a gay bar? Like, imagine the world. The United States Army is inviting its service members to return to the branch who had been separated over the refusal of the COVID-19 vaccine. The Army issued a recent letter to former service members informing them that they can apply to return to service following the rescission of the vaccine requirement. The Army had enacted 4 separations for unvaccinated service members early last year and announced in early 2023 that they had rescinded the mandate for current service members and applicants. The letter uploaded to X reads, "Dear former service member," and I'll read it here verbatim for you. "Dear former service member, we write to notify you of new Army guidance surrounding the correction of military records for former members of the Army following rescission of the COVID-19 vaccination requirement. As a result of the rescission of so let's try that again. We write to notify you of the new Army guidance regarding the correction of military records of the former members of the Army following the rescission of the COVID-19 vaccination requirement. As a result of the rescission of all current COVID-19 vaccination requirements, former soldiers who were involuntarily separated for refusal to receive the COVID-19 vaccination may request a correction of their military records from either or both of the Army Discharge Review Board or the Army Board for Correction of Military Records. Individuals may request a correction to military personnel records, including records regarding the characterization of a discharge, by submitting a request to the ADB or the ADRB or the ABCMR online at said URL. Individuals who desire to apply to return to service should contact their local U.S. Army Reserves or Army recruiter for more information. Individuals may locate an Army recruiter by visiting that website. How about no? How about if you want to mandate upon my body a experimental drug that we now know caused harm to me, that you did not have my best interest in mind. You had the best interest in mind of pharmaceutical companies. You had the best interest in mind of saving political face to half of the country who wanted to, call on people to have separation of workforce and have people lose their jobs and lose their livelihood and not be able to even see their grandma in a hospital if they don't get vaccinated, right? Like we went so crazy during COVID. And now you see them walking everything back, even the Army walking back the ability now to join again, now that they hit no recruiting numbers that they've like the lowest recruiting numbers we've seen in a very long time, in one of the most highest tension times in American history. So no, you have to look at this and take a stand and say, this person, this entity, this thing did not, and obviously most people in the military know that the military does not immediately have their best interest in mind. Let's be very clear about that. But in this case, the only thing they had in mind was how do we make profits for the pharmaceutical companies, which is actually where vaccines became popularized to begin with. So we can touch on that fairly quickly, which is that the reason that vaccines became mandated even in schools was because the penicillin manufacturers, which is where vaccines became very prevalent, was penicillin shots during World War II. Penicillin, because of World War II, was used so often. And so the people who came up with the penicillin shot, and I believe if you go back and look, it was Pfizer, and I have a book back here called Code Blue. See if that knocks over my whole thing here. This book, Code Blue, is a tremendous read. It's Inside America's Medical Industrial Complex. And it goes back into the history. And I actually did a whole breakdown of this on the very first episode that I did. So go back and listen to the very, very first episode of the Red Pill Revolution podcast, which you can just find in the feed that you're on right now, where it talks about this and why the penicillin became such a prevalent drug and why it was mandated in schools was specifically due to the fact that they had built so many industrial plants to build penicillin that they, I'll put this here for you guys, that they essentially needed to continue perpetuating that profitability. So instead of shutting down all their manufacturing plants for penicillin, they actually started to spend their money on lobbying Washington to make it mandatory within schools that you now vaccinate your children. And the reason they were doing this for soldiers was because people were coming back with like gangrene and all types of shit in World War II. And I went into the military. When I went in the military, we call it a peanut butter shot. One of the very first things that you get is a big needle shoved in your ass so that they can inject you with penicillin for no reason at all, by the way. None of us were, well, maybe not none of us, but I wasn't sick when I went in. I didn't need penicillin, but they just give it to you because you're cattle. That's all you are to them is cattle. So when you talk about what happened here, you realize that it was far more about appeasing the pharmaceutical complexes that probably lobbied to make it mandatory within the military than it was about, and who that helped at the very top of the military that makes these decisions, right? There's lobbying in that aspect too. So I find it comical. Absolutely not. You showed your hand and we will not be a part of it. No matter how many cool, badass advertisements you put out showing straight white men, you showed your hand and now you don't get the support. And that was obviously a mistake.
Adam's Archive.